all of these lines represent the electrical changes that are happening either in the atria, which is the P wave, or in the ventricles, QRS wave, during each phase of the cardiac cycle. And where does the cardiac cycle begin? Where does the cardiac cycle begin, folks? Ventricular contraction. And when will ventricles contract? They will contract only after there is additional calcium that has come into the ventricular muscle. Agreed? And in order for the ventricular muscle to get into the plateau phase, the ventricular muscle itself, the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, the alpha receptors in the heart, the beta receptors in the heart need to be stimulated. The Purkinje fibers are going to lead that information to the myocardium. The myocardial membrane depolarizes, comes to the plateau phase. That's when the calcium comes in. The concept we're trying to nail down is, in order for a muscle to contract, what is the first thing that must happen? The muscle must first depolarize. And that depolarization of the muscle is what we refer to as the muscle action potential. And the muscle action potential in the atrial tissue is represented by, collectively, all of the fibers of the atria generate the P wave. All of the fibers of the ventricular tissue generate the QRS complex, because it's more than one wave. It's a complex because it's more than one wave. And so, yesterday we talked about this. When would you expect the atria to contract during the ECG recording? Do they contract during the P wave? Remember, electrical activity will occur before the contraction occurs. So the muscle must first generate the action potential. The P wave must first be completed before that muscle contracts. Make sense? Therefore, contraction, atrial contraction will occur somewhere between the PR interval, or the PR segment. So contraction. The ECG, keep this in mind, the ECG does not record contractions. It records only the electrical changes that are happening in the atrial tissue and the ventricular tissue. And what are the only two electrical changes that can occur in any excitable tissue? Membrane depolarizes. Following that, membrane will repolarize. So the P wave represents the atrial depolarization wave. That's the wave that starts on the right atrium and moves towards the left atrium. And then the QRS complex is the wave that is recorded when that same signal from the SA node now goes through the AV bundle and then starts depolarizing the tissues of the ventricle. That would be the QRS complex. So atrial contraction, mechanical event, occurs after the atria have depolarized, after the P wave. And when the atria contract, what must the ventricles be doing? Relaxed. Keep in mind that in order for the ventricles to contract, the QRS wave needs to have been generated. And so we can safely assume that the atrial contraction will occur when the ventricle has not yet been depolarized. Make sense? And what is the ventricular depolarization wave represented on the ECG? QRS complex. Therefore, the atria must contract somewhere between after the P wave and before the QRS complex is completed. Follow me? It's only after the QRS is completed that the ventricles will now start contracting. And where would that ventricular contraction occur? Talk to me.
Before T?
After the P wave and before the T wave. Oh my God, what in the world is this T wave? Once a muscle has depolarized, what's the next thing that needs to happen? Muscle will repolarize. The T wave represents ventricular repolarization. It's coming back to the resting membrane potential. So that the next signal will cause the second QRS complex. Follow me? So what's missing in the ECG? Atrial repolarization is missing. Why? It's covered up by the QRS complex. The QRS complex represents ventricular depolarization. So the ventricles are depolarizing, the atria must be repolarizing. When the ventricles are contracting, the atria must be relaxing. Keep that correlation in mind. Follow me? When the atrial chambers contract, ventricles must relax. When the ventricles contract, the atria must relax. When the atria are depolarized, the ventricles are repolarizing. When the ventricles are depolarizing, the atria should be doing the opposite. So, make the connection between action potentials and The P wave on the one hand for atrial depolarization, QRS complex, and T wave for ventricular depolarization and repolarization. Correlate these with the contractions and recognize, register where the contractions will occur. If you're asked, which of the following represents the ECG, the component of the ECG where the atria contract? Another question may be, when would you expect, during an ECG recording, which part of the ECG is where you would expect the ventricles to be contracted? Got it? And so, all you're looking at is, you know that the beginning of the ventricular contraction starts at the beginning of that line. And what is the first phase of ventricular contraction? It's known as period of isovolemic what? Contraction. During the period of isovolemic contraction, the muscle has started generating tension, isn't it? The muscle has started generating tension, it has started the contraction at the apex, and the contraction has not spread all the way to the base of the ventricles. Follow me? That's why the QRS complex is still sitting on there waiting to be generated. But once the QRS complex has been completed, once the S wave is completed, the ventricles have been completely depolarized. Now the ventricles begin the contraction itself. And the contraction will occur between the S and the T wave. Now, let's look at the next figure. Down here, the same lines. So, period of isovolemic contraction. The next would be the period of ejection. Remember? The pressure within the ventricle has increased to a point where the aortic valve and the pulmonic valve are now going to be opened. That's the period of ejection, that large area, the long time between the second line, vertical line, and the third vertical line. And so, these first two segments of these timelines would represent ventricular, isovolemic ventricular contraction and period of ejection. Now the ventricles start relaxing, period of isovolemic relaxation, followed by the period of passive filling, followed by the period of active filling. That completes one cardiac cycle. So all you're doing is pay attention to these lines. Once you do that, then you can recognize that, you've got dotted line and you've got a solid line. And then you also got a dotted line. These are all pressures. These are all pressures in different parts of the ventricle as well as in the aorta. So what is this pressure that we see that's coming down to the dashed line? Look at the numbers. It's coming down to about 80 millimeters of mercury. That represents the pressure of the blood in the aorta. Got it? The dashed line represents the pressure of the blood in the aorta. Whereas the pressure of the blood in the atria is represented by the lower dashed line. Ignore that. That's not as important for us. Follow me? Maybe for a cardiologist. Ignore this lower atrial pressure curve during the phases of the cardiac cycle. You want to pay attention to the arterial pressure, in this particular case, the aortic pressure, pressure of the blood in the aorta, which is the upper dashed line, and you want to pay attention to the intraventricular, left ventricular pressure, that is the solid line. Where does the contraction begin? Where does the cardiac cycle begin? Ventricular contraction. So let's start out with the pressure that is involved during the contraction. That's where the contraction begins. The period of isovolemic contraction. Note this is pressure. The volume doesn't change, but the pressure increases. Are you guys seeing that? The pressure increases, but the volume hasn't begun to change because the lumen of the left ventricle has not yet been altered. Ventricle is continuing to contract for that short duration of time. The pressure of the blood within the ventricle increases. Once the pressure of the blood inside the ventricle exceeds the pressure of blood in the aorta, the aortic valve will open. Got it? The aortic valve opens. Once the aortic valve opens, the ventricle is continuing to contract, and therefore the blood now is ejected into the aorta. And that's what this curve. Note that this dashed line, as soon as the blood comes into the aorta, the pressure of the blood in the aorta / pressure of the blood in the brachial artery will proportionally increase. Up until a point that the ventricles complete the contraction, and once the ventricles complete the contraction, they begin the process of relaxation. Therefore, the pressure of the blood inside the ventricle now starts going down. And that's when the blood wants to come back from the aorta, the blood wants to come back into the ventricle, bounce back. What do you call that notch? Dichrotic notch. And once the dichrotic notch has been formed, ventricles are continuing to contract, therefore the intraventricular pressure starts dropping, and the blood pressure, after bouncing back, will come back to, and when the ventricles are relaxing, the blood is going to be filling the heart, and therefore the pressure of the blood in the aorta is going to come back down to the diastolic pressure. Question?
Why do the semilunar valves close at higher pressure than they open?
Why does the semilunar valve close at a higher pressure than the pressure that is needed for them to open? What he's asking is, take a look at the pressure. That pressure is around 100. Whereas this pressure to open the semilunar valve, it's only 80. Whereas that pressure is 100. What do we have? Have we injected extra blood into the aorta?
Yes.
Okay. And if there is extra blood, what does that do to the pressure? The pressure is higher. Follow me? And as soon as the ventricle starts relaxing, the blood wants to come back because the pressure gradient has been set up right there. And the valve will close at that higher pressure only because the pressure of blood in the aorta is much higher than when the pressure of the blood, compared to the pressure of the blood when the valve opened. Okay? So, the diastolic pressure is the pressure that needs to be overcome to begin ejection. But once the systole, the ejection has occurred, when does the maximum volume of blood get into the aorta? Is it at the beginning of the period of ejection, middle of the period of ejection, or at the end of the period of ejection?
The end.
Say again?
End.
Is it at the beginning of the period of ejection, middle, or end? What is the question? When does the maximum volume of blood get ejected into the aorta?
The end.
Look.
At the end.
At the, how do you say it? It's at the end. Take a look at the peak of the pressure. When is the blood pressure highest? Is it highest? Blood pressure, not the pressure inside the ventricle. When is the blood pressure the highest? At the beginning of the ventricular ejection period? Now, the pressure is higher where? At the middle of the period of ejection. That's the period of ejection, isn't it, folks? Period of isovolumic contraction, period of ejection. When is the blood pressure highest? At the period of ejection. Therefore, when will the largest volume of blood be shoved into the aorta? It's going to be at the same time when the pressure is also highest, because the pressure and volume are going to correlate with each other.
I'm just looking at the printout here, it shows volume underneath it, and the slope of the lines, steepest at the beginning, so to me that means the volume's going to be over the past.
What do you say?